It began not in briefing rooms nor in the clipped certainties of official orders, but in the murmurs between pilots as they paced the hard floors of dispersal huts. Among the chipped mugs of tea and the acrid scent of oil-stained overalls, a rumor had taken flight, one that spoke of a maneuver so reckless, so defiant of logic, that only fools or masters dared attempt it. They called it, quietly, the elevator trick. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others, especially the young replacements fresh from training, believed it was nothing more than bravado from seasoned aces trying to haunt their nerves. But those who had seen it, truly seen it, spoke in a different tone. Not boastful, not triumphant, but solemn, as if they had witnessed something unnatural above the clouds. According to the stories, a Spitfire, hounded and moments from destruction, would suddenly pull into a near-vertical climb, hanging by its propeller blade like a dying moth. The German Messerschmitt, Bf 109, locked in pursuit, would follow instinctively, expecting a simple kill. And then, impossibly, the Spitfire would disappear. To the chasing pilot, it was as if the British machine had evaporated into a bank of cloud. A heartbeat later, it would reappear, not ahead, but behind, guns already aligned. Pilots who returned claiming to have pulled it off could never fully explain it. They spoke instead of feel, of weightlessness, of a shudder that rattled bones through aluminum skin, of a moment between flight and fall where gravity itself seemed to pause. To engineers and instructors, it made no aerodynamic sense. To pilots, it was something deeper, a conversation between instinct and machinery. And to the enemy, it was something closer to witchcraft. "They rise like ghosts," one German pilot reportedly wrote in a hastily scribbled note recovered from a downed Bf 109's cockpit. "They climb beyond possibility, then fall upon us." The Luftwaffe, well drilled and confident after sweeping triumphs in Poland and France, had no name for it, but among the Royal Air Force it became law. Britain in the summer of 1940 was an island under siege, its fate pinned to the wings of a young Air Force fighting for every breath of sky. The enemy came daily across the Channel, sleek silver predators with black crosses on their wings. Every town and airfield heard the rising whine of sirens, the rolling thunder of bombs. Each pilot knew he was meant to survive no more than 4 weeks. Yet it was in that crucible of desperation that the rumor of the elevator trick began to spread, first as a whispered tale, then as an unspoken challenge. Could you control the moment where lift ends and falling begins? The maneuver was never taught on blackboards. No chalk diagrams explained how to defy an enemy climbing at your tail. For every Spitfire that soared, another smoldered in a field. Manuals did not speak of the strange dance between stalling and rolling, between lift and surrender. It was born instead from accident. Young pilots pulling too hard on the stick in blind panic, discovering in terror the razor's edge between control and catastrophe. Most saved themselves by luck. A few discovered something more. These were the men who came back, pale and silent, muttering, "I saw him overshoot." They did not describe it in detail. How could they? It felt less like flight and more like falling with intention. And so the legend grew. The ground crews heard it first, passing it between tents as they cleaned oil from their hands and bolted fresh wings to wounded machines. Then came the armorers and riggers, tightening their lips as pilots hinted at secret tricks and silent kills. Some denied it outright. Others blinked slowly and said nothing. The RAF was outnumbered, exhausted, and barely holding the line. Squadrons rotated through airfields so rapidly that pilots slept in cockpits, waking to sirens. Machines came back shredded by cannon shells, patched together through the night, sent back into combat at dawn. In those conditions, truth bent easily into myth. And yet, The Germans began to report it too. Intelligence officers in Berlin read strange accounts from veterans of the Condor Legion, men trained in merciless precision. They described Spitfires that halted mid-air as if struck by invisible force, only to plunge and rise again like hawks. Their commanders dismissed these tales as combat haze. "Engage with discipline, not superstition," came the official reply. But one ace, reportedly furious, scrawled in a margin, "I fired, and he vanished upward. No machine should do that." What no one yet understood, not the pilots who feared it, nor the engineers who doubted it, was that this maneuver, this elevator trick, was neither miracle nor madness. It was mathematics written in metal. It was the shape of the Spitfire's wing, drawn years before war, and the raw nerve of a pilot willing to ride the boundary between flight and stall. It was Britain itself, a machine pushed to its breaking point, refusing to break. On the ground, Prime Minister Churchill famously told the nation, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But in the air, among the few, another truth took shape. Survival would not belong to the fastest, nor to the strongest. It would belong to those who dared to fall and rise again. And so, somewhere above the Channel's grey waters, a Spitfire once more tilted heavenward, its pilot gripping the trembling stick, engines screaming against gravity. And behind him, a Messerschmitt followed, confident, hungry. Neither pilot knew that in seconds, the sky would witness something no manual had ever dared to teach. The elevator trick was about to be born again. By June of 1940, the war for Britain's survival had shifted from the ground to the skies. The fate of the island no longer depended on ships or tanks, but on young men in single-engine fighters clawing for position thousands of feet above the Channel. Altitude was life. Whoever held the higher sky controlled the fight, and in that narrow blue band between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, two machines would meet again and again. Britain's Supermarine Spitfire, MKAO, and Germany's Messerschmitt, Bf-109E. They were born from opposite philosophies. The Spitfire was elegant, an artist's curve rendered in aluminum. Designed by R.J. Mitchell, its wings followed a perfect ellipse, a shape chosen not for beauty but for lift efficiency and airflow. The Messerschmitt, by contrast, was all logic and aggression, angular, compact, and brutally efficient. Where the Spitfire whispered through the air, the 109 sliced it. Each represented its nation's character, one fluid, one mechanical, yet their performance numbers were so close that victory hinged not on hardware, but on the heartbeat of the pilot behind the stick. The Spitfire's Merlin III engine produced roughly 1,030 horsepower. At full climb, it could gain 2,530 feet per minute and reach 355 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. Its rival, the Bf-109E, carried Daimler-Benz's DB601A engine, slightly more powerful at under 100 horsepower, and a top speed that matched within a few miles. On paper, the German fighter should have dictated the fight. Its fuel-injected engine meant it could push -G, dive inverted, and keep feeding fuel while the Merlin's carburetor starved the Spitfire whenever it went upside down. Every British trainee learned to fear that sputtering cough, the sound of a Merlin choking as gravity pulled fuel away from its carburetor bowls. German doctrine relied on that advantage. Their aces attacked from above, diving hard, then climbing back up through the sun in a disciplined rhythm called boom and zoom. The Bf-109 was built for that energy fight. Narrow wings, high loading, immense power in a dive. The Spitfire, by comparison, was more forgiving in a turn but less tolerant of inverted flight. It should have been outclassed in vertical maneuvering. Yet over Kent, Sussex, and the Channel coast, something unexpected began to happen. British pilots, flying from ragged grass strips at Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and Manston, found ways to turn their weakness into an ambush. when a 109 latched onto a Spitfire's tail. Conventional wisdom said to dive away. The German would stall first if forced into a hard turn. But those who had survived enough encounters noticed a sliver of opportunity in the climb instead. The Spitfire's wing loading, just 22 pounds per square foot, gave it an almost buoyant lift compared to the Messerschmitt's heavier 40+. It could hold a steep angle of attack a heartbeat longer before its airflow separated. That heartbeat was the difference between hunter and hunted. In that blink of time, the Spitfire could rise, hang, and, if handled with perfect rudder control, flip nose down while the pursuing 109 overshot helplessly. To outsiders, this sounded like suicide. To the pilots trapped in that moment, with tracer fire carving arcs around their canopy, it was pure instinct. One squadron leader later said, "I pulled straight up until she trembled. The nose hung, I kicked the rudder, and suddenly he was in my sights." It was the kind of move no instructor dared teach. Pull too early, and the aircraft stalled into a spin. Pull too late, and cannon shells tore through your fuselage. Only experience and desperation could tell a pilot when the impossible line between lift and fall appeared. Meanwhile, on the ground, British mechanics fought their own war. Every hour of flight demanded 11 hours of maintenance. The Merlin engine needed endless tuning, magnetos adjusted, carburetor floats leveled, spark plugs cleaned in cold morning air thick with exhaust. Fuel was rationed like gold. 65 gallons disappeared in an hour of combat power, and Britain's entire aviation spirit reserve barely covered weeks. The Luftwaffe had trains bringing fuel from Hamburg and Ploesti. Britain had convoys stocked by U-boats. That the RAF could keep its squadrons flying at all was a logistical miracle stitched together by factory workers in Southampton, Reading, and Castle Bromwich. Factories bombed nightly, yet still producing hundreds of Spitfires a month. Up above, this industrial miracle translated into moments of fragile grace. The Battle of Britain was not a grand clash of armadas. It was fought in pairs, spirals, and streaks of vapor at the edge of physics. A single mistake meant flame and sea. The men in those cockpits were barely older than 20. Many had fewer than 150 flying hours. They did not think in terms of wing loading or rate of climb, son. They thought only of survival, and when survival demanded new rules, they invented them in real time. The elevator trick was one of those inventions born not from theory, but from terror and instinct. As August burned into September, German squadrons pressed harder. The Luftwaffe still believed its machines superior, its pilots unbeatable. Yet in their debriefs, commanders began to hear strange reports. Spitfires vanishing upward, then reappearing behind their pursuers. At first they blamed optical illusions or sun glare, but patterns emerged. The British were finding a way to flip the vertical fight. For the first time, altitude supremacy began to slip from German hands. The sky over southern England became a laboratory of survival. Every climb, every dive, was a test of both man and machine. The pilots of the RAF were learning something their designers had never written in the blueprints, that the Spitfire's curves concealed hidden gifts. It could twist and stall and still recover, where other aircraft snapped like twigs. It could rise higher on faith alone, even when the fuel line faltered. And as the sun set over fields littered with twisted metal, Britain's defenders understood that they were not merely flying airplanes. They were flying the edge of creation itself. Machines balanced so precisely that courage became part of the design. Down below, families listened to the drone of engines over the coast and wondered who would not return. Up above, among the contrails and flak bursts, the whispered rumor of the elevator trick began to take shape. Not as myth now, but as method. It would soon earn its first confirmed kill, and with it, a place in the legend of the Battle of Britain. Long before anyone dared to name it, the first true accounts of the elevator maneuver came not from engineers nor tacticians, but from the shaken voices of pilots who had survived by inches. They did not boast about it. They whispered it, quietly, privately, like men unsure if they'd witnessed skill, miracle, or madness. One of the earliest to speak of it was squadron leader Alan Deere of No. 54 Squadron. He was no fresh-faced recruit. Deere had already been tested by fire and loss. In mid-1940, he recounted a moment that would later be etched into RAF combat history. He was being hunted, locked in the sights of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, its cannons flashing deadly sparks into the summer sky. Deere had seconds. No room to turn, no speed to dive. So he pulled back. "I hauled her nose straight up," he later wrote. "She hung there. God, she hung there. I felt her shudder, then I kicked the rudder, and suddenly I was looking down at him." It made no sense. The human mind is not built to reconcile upward stalling with downward attack. And yet there he was, one breath from death, now predator instead of prey. He fired only a 1-second burst, but that was all it took. 8 Browning 303s spat fury. The Messerschmitt fell trailing glycol, its lifeblood, into the channel below. To onlookers, it must have looked like luck, even accident. It was anything but. A pilot could not force such a maneuver. He had to invite it, balance the aircraft at the very lip of aerodynamic collapse. 1 ounce too much rudder and she'd spin. 1 ounce too little and the 109's cannons would rip him open. The Spitfire demanded trust, absolute trust, in the breath before the fall. Another pilot, Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, one of the youngest in the Battle of Britain, spoke of the maneuver not in terms of tactics, but sensation. In his memoir, First Light, he remembered the physical unreality of it. The world went silent. The nose pointed towards the sun. I felt weightless, and then a crushing push, as if the earth grabbed the wingtips. When I leveled, the 109 flashed ahead of me, right in my guns. Wellham did not call it a trick. He did not even call it deliberate. He called it a moment of surrender, a letting go of control in order to find it again. That was the horror and beauty of the elevator maneuver. It was not born from confidence, but from desperation. Other pilots were less willing to talk about it. Some feared they'd be accused of recklessness. Others feared they'd be ordered never to attempt it again. Air chiefs, after all, wanted discipline, patterns, formations, doctrine. But the sky cared little for doctrine. For some, the memory of their first accidental elevator reversal was terrifying. Pilot Officer John Dundas once described a chase where he overpulled in panic. He expected the stall to kill him, yet instead found himself inverted, nose down, with his attacker overshooting like a dart thrown past its mark. He survived, but he never spoke of it in open debrief. Only later, over whiskey and cigarettes, did he murmur, "I don't know if I flew her, or if she flew me." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe reports began mentioning unusual vertical maneuvers by British pilots. Some German flyers dismissed them as illusions, tricks of sun and stress. But those who had been there, those who barely escaped, knew better. One unnamed ace returned to base pale and silent, refused brandy offered by his fellow officers. He muttered only this: "I followed him up. He should have stalled." But he vanished. In Berlin, analysts marked such reports as combat fatigue hallucinations. But they kept coming. To those on the ground, these were simply stories. But to the few who had ridden that impossible edge, a Spitfire trembling on the verge of stall, they were something sacred. They had felt the wings lose grip, felt the sudden hush as air no longer flowed over metal. They had lived for one heartbeat, without flight, only to find themselves reborn in it. For some, it felt like theft. They had stolen life back from death. For others, it felt like prayer, but to all, it was unforgettable. As more pilots attempted it, some intentionally, some purely out of fear, a pattern emerged. Those who survived described three sensations as if reciting ritual: the tremor, the shiver of the airframe, warning that lift was dying; the silence, a moment of eerie stillness, engine screaming but soul weightless; the drop, the earth lunging upward as gravity reclaimed its debt. To master the elevator maneuver was not to command the aircraft, but to let it fall and trust it would rise. It defied manuals. It rejected reason. And yet those who dared it began changing the sky. The RAF would never formally teach it. No chalkboard would ever bear its name. But among pilots, its reputation grew like stormlight at the edge of vision. Something new had entered the air war. Something beyond engines, beyond orders, born only from instinct and the courage to fall. And the enemy had no answer for it. Long before anyone dared to name it, the first true accounts of the elevator maneuver came not from engineers nor tacticians, but from the shaken voices of pilots who had survived by inches. They did not boast about it. They whispered it, quietly, privately, like men unsure if they'd witnessed skill, miracle, or madness. One of the earliest to speak of it was squadron leader Alan Deere of No. 54 Squadron. He was no fresh-faced recruit. Deere had already been tested by fire and loss. In mid-1940, he recounted a moment that would later be etched into RAF combat history. He was being hunted, locked in the sights of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, its cannons flashing deadly sparks into the summer sky. Deere had seconds, no room to turn, no speed to dive. So he pulled back. "I hauled her nose straight up," he later wrote. "She hung there. God, she hung there. I felt her shudder, then I kicked the rudder, and suddenly I was looking down at him." It made no sense. A human mind is not built to reconcile upward stalling with downward attack. And yet there he was, one breath from death, now predator instead of prey. He fired only a 1-second burst, but that was all it took. 8 Browning 303s spat fury. The Messerschmitt fell trailing glycol, its lifeblood, into the channel below. To onlookers, it must have looked like luck, even accident. It was anything but. A pilot could not force such a maneuver. He had to invite it, balance the aircraft at the very lip of aerodynamic collapse. 1 ounce too much rudder and she'd spin. 1 ounce too little and the 109's cannons would rip him open. The Spitfire demanded trust, absolute trust, in the breath before the fall. Another pilot, Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, one of the youngest in the Battle of Britain, spoke of the maneuver not in terms of tactics, but sensation. In his memoir, First Light, he remembered the physical unreality of it. The world went silent. The nose pointed toward the sun. I felt weightless, and then a crushing push, as if the earth grabbed the wingtips. When I leveled, the 109 flashed ahead of me, right in my guns. Wellham did not call it a trick. He did not even call it deliberate. He called it a moment of surrender, a letting go of control in order to find it again. That was the horror and beauty of the elevator maneuver. It was not born from confidence, but from desperation. Other pilots were less willing to talk about it. Some feared they'd be accused of recklessness. Others feared they'd be ordered never to attempt it again. Air chiefs, after all, wanted discipline, patterns, formations, doctrine. But the sky cared little for doctrine. For some, the memory of their first accidental elevator reversal was terrifying. Pilot officer John Dundas once described a chase where he overpulled in panic. He expected the stall to kill him, yet instead found himself inverted, nose down, with his attacker overshooting like a dart thrown past its mark. He survived, but he never spoke of it in open debrief. Only later, over whiskey and cigarettes, did he murmur, "I don't know if I flew her, or if she flew me." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe reports began mentioning unusual vertical maneuvers by British pilots. Some German flyers dismissed them as illusions, tricks of sun and stress. But those who had been there, those who barely escaped, knew better. One unnamed ace, returned to base pale and silent, refused brandy offered by his fellow officers. He muttered only this: "I followed him up. He should have stalled, but he vanished." In Berlin, analysts marked such reports as combat fatigue hallucinations, but they kept coming. To those on the ground, these were simply stories. But to the few who had ridden that impossible edge, a Spitfire trembling on the verge of stall, they were something sacred. They had felt the wings lose grip, felt the sudden hush as air no longer flowed over metal. They had lived for one heartbeat without flight, only to find themselves reborn in it. For some, it felt like theft. They had stolen life back from death. For others, it felt like prayer, but to all, it was unforgettable. As more pilots attempted it, some intentionally, some purely out of fear, a pattern emerged. Those who survived described three sensations as if reciting ritual: the tremor, the shiver of the airframe, warning that lift was dying; the silence, a moment of eerie stillness, engine screaming but soul weightless; the drop, the earth lunging upward as gravity reclaimed its debt. To master the elevator maneuver was not to command the aircraft, but to let it fall, and trust it would rise. It defied manuals. It rejected reason. And yet, those who dared it began changing the sky. The RAF would never formally teach it. No chalkboard would ever bear its name. But among pilots, its reputation grew like stormlight at the edge of vision. Something new had entered the air war. Something beyond engines, beyond orders, born only from instinct and the courage to fall. And the enemy had no answer for it. Before the elevator maneuver became legend, it was only a whisper of possibility, something pilots felt more than understood. But behind the mystique lay cold, precise science. It was not magic that let a Spitfire climb beyond reason and flip on command. It was mathematics written in metal, born years before war had even arrived. The Spitfire, long before it fought, was designed to hover on the thin edge between flight and fall. At the center of the secret was its elliptical wing, a shape no other combat aircraft of the time possessed. Designed by visionary engineer R.J. Mitchell, the elliptical wing was more than aesthetic grace. It created even lift distribution across the span, delaying stall to the farthest edge. Where most wings lost control abruptly, the Spitfires lost it gradually, whispering a warning through a trembling frame. That tremble, that subtle shudder, became the signature moment of the elevator trick. A pilot could feel stall before it killed him. The Spitfire's wing loading was equally critical, just 22.3 pounds per square foot, compared to the Bf-109's heavier loading, often over 40 pounds depending on fuel and ammunition load. In raw terms, this meant one thing: a Spitfire could cling to air longer. It could rise slow and still keep breath, like a bird hovering against wind. The Messerschmitt, built for speed and plunge, could not follow such a slow, deliberate climb without bleeding its energy and stalling violently. In controlled tests years later, engineers would discover something astonishing. In a steep, vertical pitch, the Spitfire could momentarily hang at impossible angles, as high as 70 to 80 degrees, without immediate stall, provided the pilot held his nerve. Every fraction of a degree mattered. Pull too sharply, and the wing would snap into full stall. Pull too timidly, and the enemy would fire. The elevator maneuver, then, demanded more than courage. It demanded a pilot who listened to his aircraft. Yet wings alone did not perform this trick. The engine, ironically, one with a flaw, played its part. The Rolls-Royce Merlin III, with its carbureted fuel delivery, was notorious for choking under negative G. In a dive, inverted, it would starve itself, and sputter like a drowning beast. German pilots mocked the British for this weakness. Their Daimler-Benz DB601A, with fuel injection, could dive inverted flawlessly. But those same German pilots never suspected this vulnerability held a hidden gift. Under extreme positive G, when the Spitfire surged nose up, the Merlin's supercharger impeller could deliver a brief torque spike, a burst of raw thrust beyond rated power. Pilots felt it as a lurch, a violent shove upwards, as if the aircraft refused to let go of the sky. This was never in manuals. Rolls-Royce never advertised it. It was a quirk, a side effect, but in the hands of a desperate ace, quirks become weapons. Even the airframe's control harmony aided the maneuver. The Spitfire had extraordinarily light control forces, especially in the elevator surface. Its tailplane, finely balanced, responded almost telepathically. Pilots could flick the rudder and elevator simultaneously, entering a controlled stall roll. A dangerous dance. One false move and the aircraft would drop into a flat spin, unrecoverable. But those who mastered it could make the Spitfire pivot around its center of gravity, pivoting in midair like a falcon breaking from hover. Meanwhile, the Bf-109, designed by Willy Messerschmitt, suffered in this arena. Its automatic leading-edge slats, intended to prevent stall, would snap open in vertical climbs, disrupting smooth lift. German pilots described it as a violent wing shudder, a sudden lateral whip. When chasing a Spitfire vertically, the 109 often bucked sideways, losing sight of the quarry for a fatal moment. One Luftwaffe technical officer, analyzing gun camera footage, wrote coldly, "Do not contest the British in the vertical when they pull beyond 45 degrees. The machine betrays us there." But few pilots listened. The combat is not waged with reports, but with instinct, and instinct drove them upward into the trap. To understand how tightly the Spitfire walked the edge of aerodynamic law, one must imagine the cockpit at the maneuver's peak. Instruments spinning, horizon gone. The pilot feels only vibration, first a warning tremor, then a breathless pause. At that instant, airflow over the wing has collapsed. Lift is gone. Control surfaces drift into uselessness. The machine is no longer flying. It is falling. And that is when the Spitfire strikes. With a sharp rudder kick just at the edge of stall, the aircraft yaws violently, rolling over the top, snapping nose down. Gravity becomes ally, not enemy. The pursuing 109, heavier, faster, unable to pivot, shoots forward like an arrow past the mark. In that brief, annihilating instant, the hunter becomes the hunted. Engine, wing, airframe. Every part of the Spitfire was not just built for speed, but for forgiveness, the gentle decay of lift, not the catastrophic break. German pilots later admitted in interviews that they feared this most, the plane that refused to die when it should have. Only later, after the war, would designers and historians declare what pilots had already known through instinct. The elevator trick was not defiance of physics. It was absolute obedience to it. It was the British mastery of limits, flying as close to aerodynamic death as possible, without crossing it. And that, more than speed, was what Germany could not match. To understand why the Bf-109 could never truly follow the Spitfire into the deadly elegance of the elevator maneuver, one must imagine the German pilot strapped into that angular cockpit, rigid stick in hand, convinced his machine, fast, furious, and fuel-injected, could outclimb anything in the sky. The Messerschmitt was engineered for brutal efficiency. Dive fast, strike hard, and climb back to safety in the clean rhythm of boom and zoom. In theory, it should have dominated every vertical engagement. And yet, that very doctrine, this reliance on power over finesse, became its undoing. When a Spitfire suddenly pitched skyward and appeared to hang against gravity, instinct screamed at the German pilot to chase. In that instant, the Bf-109 entered a trap woven by physics. With its higher wing loading and narrow, stiff airframe, the 109 bled speed the moment it pointed upward. Its automatic leading-edge slats, designed to delay stall, often snapped open asymmetrically, causing a sudden sideways jerk that threw off aim at the most critical second. Unlike the Spitfire's forgiving elliptical wings, which whispered their impending stall through a trembling shudder, the Bf-109 offered no such grace. One moment it climbed, the next it snapped, sometimes spiraling without warning. And worst of all, its controls grew heavy under stress. High in a climb, the stick fought against the pilot's will, while the Spitfires remained light, sensitive, almost alive. German pilots reported in frustration that the British machines rose like phantoms, vanishing from the gun sight before reappearing behind them in a burst of Brownings. Luftwaffe analysts eventually issued formal warnings. Do not pursue Spitfires beyond 45 degrees without energy advantage. But pride, sharpened in earlier victories, compelled many aces to ignore such doctrine. They believed no British pilot would dare a full-stall maneuver. They were wrong. In a true elevator reversal, as the Bf-109 strained and stalled, the Spitfire rolled over the top and fell upon it like a descending hawk. No speed, no chase, just silence, then fire. Even Germany's finest, like Hans-Joachim Marseille, were forced to concede. If the Spitfire goes straight up, I do not follow. It was not that the Messerschmitt lacked power. It was that it lacked forgiveness. In the end, the Bf-109 was a blade, rigid and lethal, but incapable of dancing on the edge of the stall. The Spitfire was different. It embraced that edge, mastered it, and turned the very moment before falling into a weapon. And that is why, high over the Channel, many German pilots chased the British fighter into the vertical, only to discover too late that they were climbing directly into their own destruction. The elevator trick, for all its lethality, was never a maneuver learned in safety, but one discovered in terror, and it exacted a severe toll on those who dared to test the edge of flight. To master it meant approaching the threshold where an aircraft ceased to be a machine and became a falling weight, and in those fatal seconds many young pilots gambled everything and lost. Among the earliest casualties was Pilot Officer Peter Cannard of No. 610 Squadron, a promising flyer with only weeks of combat behind him. On September 15, 1940, near Beachy Head, Cannard attempted the vertical reversal under pressure from pursuing Bf-109s. Witnesses on the coast saw his Spitfire climb unnaturally steep, almost suspending in the air before its nose snapped over. But instead of rolling cleanly into a descending strike, the airframe shuddered under violent aerodynamic stress. A split second later, the tail sheared away, the wings folded like torn paper. The Spitfire disintegrated mid-air, scattering across the Channel in fragments. There was no parachute, no recovery, only the echo of what might have been a kill had it held together. His death became a grim lesson whispered among pilots. The maneuver could not be forced. It demanded absolute precision, not desperation. The Spitfire, though seemingly invincible in legend, had limits written in rivets and alloy. Early variants were notoriously susceptible to elevator flutter at extreme dive recoveries, their control linkages rattling under 8G loads. Engineers at Farnborough recorded multiple failures in 1940, noting bursts of structural collapse at speeds exceeding 460 miles per hour. Yet these warnings rarely reached the cockpit, for in war, revisions trailed behind reality, and pilots flew machines that were still evolving beneath their hands. The RAF command never sanctioned the elevator maneuver, fearing reckless imitation, but it spread anyway through survivor's instinct. Every pilot who tried it felt the same sensations. The rising tremor of the stall, the eerie pause of weightlessness, then the violent drop as gravity reclaimed dominion. A heartbeat too soon or too late, and there was no correcting it. But catastrophe in the air was only half the cost. On the ground, another army, unacknowledged, unarmed, but essential, waged their own relentless campaign to keep those Spitfires aloft. For every hour a fighter spent in combat, ground crews labored 11. Under freezing dawns and floodlit nights, mechanics stripped engines, replaced cylinders, adjusted carburetor floats with frozen fingers, and patched torn aluminum with sheet metal hammered by hand. They rotated propeller blades by flashlight, listening for misfires in crankshaft. They fueled machines knowing one bullet could turn that fuel into fire around the pilot they'd just saluted, and they did it without glory, knowing the aircraft they returned to the skies might never return to them. Many of these men never saw the maneuvers they made possible. They only saw the empty dispersal pad, heard the fading engine, and waited. The Battle of Britain was remembered for airborne duels, but it was fought in mud and oil as much as in sunlight. Industrial Britain bent under the strain, its foundries and factories targeted nightly by bombs. Yet Spitfires kept coming. 310 in August 1940 alone, rolled out from shadowed workshops in Southampton, Castle Bromwich, and Reading, each built with the knowledge that many would last less than a month. Among pilots, a grim understanding emerged. The elevator trick was not a badge of skill, but a pact with fate. To attempt it was to acknowledge that survival would not bow to speed or firepower, only to the razor-thin mastery of stall and fall. Those who succeeded did so in silence. Those who failed vanished without trace. And still, the maneuver endured. It crawled from accident to instinct, from instinct to tactic, carried not by doctrine, but by the stories of the few who returned and spoke of the moment when the sky went silent and the world inverted. This was the true cost of mastery, not only the bodies lost in flame, but the steady, grinding sacrifice of a nation forging victory out of fragments. For while history remembers the Spitfire's climb, it forgets how often it fell. And it was in those falls, fatal or forgiven, that the elevator trick was paid for in full. By the autumn of 1940, the elevator maneuver had moved beyond whispered rumor and isolated survival. It had become a silent force warping the air war itself, forcing the Luftwaffe to confront a truth it had never anticipated. The British were rewriting the rules of vertical combat in real time. For months, German pilots approached engagements with mathematical confidence, believing their fuel-injected Messerschmitts supreme in the climb and dive. But combat reports began filtering through squadron intelligence units with a new, unsettling pattern. Spitfires ascending almost vertically, appearing to stall, then re-emerging behind their pursuers with guns already aligned. Luftwaffe staff officers, reviewing debriefs from returning aces, dismissed these accounts at first as misjudgments of angle or cloud cover. Yet gun camera footage began to confirm the impossible. British fighters were executing maneuvers that defied standard intercept doctrine. Feldwebel Franz Stigler, a respected pilot, reported bluntly, "They rise and vanish, then they are behind you." German pride, forged in victories over Poland and France, was now confronted by a maneuver it could neither replicate nor counter. In RAF squadrons, the phrase "he overshot" began appearing in combat claims linked to vertical reversals. By November 1940, internal RAF tallies attributed over 70 confirmed kills, roughly 9% of aerial victories that season, to these unorthodox climb and flip tactics. No manual recorded it. No officer ordered it, yet it was turning hunters into prey. Strategists at Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, grew uneasy. The confidential Luftwaffe bulletin issued late that year carried a stark warning. Avoid steep pursuit beyond 40 degrees against Spitfire, especially when energy parity is present. This was more than a tactical memo. It was the formal recognition of a psychological shift. The Spitfire, once viewed as a graceful turning opponent, now possessed a lethal unpredictability. Its pilots no longer fled, they climbed, and in that climb, they dared the Germans to follow. Some German units began enforcing altitude discipline, forbidding pilots to chase beyond certain pitch angles. But discipline falters in the pursuit of a kill. Many aces, eager to cement reputation, ignored warnings, pulling back hard on the stick in the heat of chase. Those who did found themselves betrayed by their own machines. Slats snapping wide, lift collapsing, the horizon vanishing as their aircraft shuddered near stall. For a few fatal seconds, they were blind, exposed, and that was when the Spitfire struck. British pilots, once wary of German power in the dive, now hunted the moment of German hunger in the climb. RAF interceptor tactics evolved subtly, almost instinctively. They began baiting the pursuit, offering their tails before lancing upward. What had been a desperate improvisation was becoming a deliberate trap. Squadron leaders spoke of trading speed for position, a cold exchange of energy for opportunity. The elevator trick, unnamed in official doctrine, was redefining kill geometry in the skies over the Channel. Its power was not in frequency, but in fear. German pilots began to hesitate at the sight of a Spitfire climbing too steeply, uncertain whether they faced a stalling target or a spring-loaded blade. That pause, no more than a heartbeat, shifted initiative. In war, hesitation is death. And so the Luftwaffe's psychological armor cracked not from bullets, but from doubt. The maneuver had achieved something rare in aerial warfare. It had introduced uncertainty into a previously precise machine. As one RAF pilot put it, they stopped chasing us upward. That was the day everything changed. The elevator maneuver, born from instinct and peril, stood on the brink of becoming not just a desperate gambit, but a refined weapon, and it was engineering, not legend, that transformed it from a dangerous improvisation into a calculated tactic. By 1941, Rolls-Royce engineers, having studied countless frontline reports, quietly addressed the Spitfire's most glaring vulnerability, its tendency to lose power under negative G due to the Merlin's float carburetor starvation. The introduction of the Merlin 45, equipped with the Bendix-Stromberg pressure carburetor, eliminated the engine cutout that once plagued inverted or high-angle climbs. No longer would the Spitfire cough and falter at the apex of the elevator reversal. Now it climbed with unwavering thrust, sustained, controlled, and intentionally lethal. With this change, what had been an act of faith became an act of will. Simultaneously, the RAF fielded the Spitfire Mk 5 and soon after, the Spitfire Mach 9, powered by the formidable Merlin 61, a two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine capable of delivering up to 1,120 horsepower at altitude. These machines could outclimb earlier models by over 1,000 feet per minute, transforming the vertical plane from a place of danger into British hunting ground. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's Bf 109, which once dominated vertical maneuvering, had begun to suffer from its own evolutionary burden. The transition from the Bf 109E to the Bf 109F and later the G series introduced added armor, heavier armament, and reinforced airframes to counter Allied firepower, but at a cost: increased weight, reduced climb rate, and stiffer handling. German aircraft, once sleek and predatory, became strained by the necessities of survival. Engineers at Messerschmitt headquarters attempted to reclaim advantage through raw power, pushing the DB601 successor, the DB605, beyond safe tolerances. But reliability lagged behind ambition. Meanwhile, British development focused not on reinventing the airframe, but continuously refining it. The Spitfire remained visually unchanged, but beneath its skin, it became a far more dangerous creature. With the Mk9, the elevator maneuver entered a new phase. It was no longer a whispered secret among aces, but an emerging doctrine of energy combat. RAF instructors at training airfields began to speak cautiously of high yo-yo reversals and stall turns, careful never to name it outright, but teaching its geometry through diagrams of velocity circles and lift vectors. The Spitfire's control harmony, its light stick forces and sensitive rudder, allowed even inexperienced pilots to explore the edge of stall with unprecedented safety compared to German contemporaries. Luftwaffe reaction, once rooted in disbelief, shifted to resignation. Reports from veteran pilots on the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts spoke of Spitfires climbing in ways previously unseen, no longer pausing, no longer sputtering. One German captain noted bitterly in a flight diary, "They now ride the stall with power. There is no mistake to exploit." What had once been risky improvisation was now a calculated ascent into lethal geometry. Even the Luftwaffe's most skilled tacticians, including the formidable Hans-Joachim Marseille, altered their combat behavior, refusing vertical pursuit and rolling away at any sign of a Spitfire pitching up. The fork in aerial evolution had become clear. Germany sought domination through firepower and armor. Britain sought mastery through control and balance. By late 1942, the elevator trick was no longer a rumor or even a trick. It was the spine of a new kind of combat, one in which victory belonged not to the aircraft that dove fastest, but to the one that could climb to the very edge of stall and remain there by choice. The sky itself had been rewritten. By 1943, what had once been a desperate maneuver whispered in dispersal huts had become an unspoken pillar of air combat philosophy. No longer an accident of survival, but a calculated exploitation of physics that separated mere flying from aerial mastery. The elevator trick, though never entered into any formal RAF manual, had quietly shaped an entire generation of fighter doctrine under a new concept. Energy management, the deliberate trading of speed for position, gravity for control. Young pilots, once terrified of stall, were now taught to embrace its fringes, to feel the tremor of lift bleeding from the wings without fear. Instructors at training stations like Sutton Bridge began diagramming vertical reversals, disguising the maneuver under sanitized terms, such as stall turn and high yo-yo, yet every seasoned pilot knew its true lineage. It was no longer chance that led a Spitfire to hang in the air. It was intent. German pilots, too, absorbed its lessons, but through avoidance rather than mastery. Luftwaffe tactical bulletins instructed airmen bluntly, "Do not pursue climbing Spitfires unless possessing clear energy advantage. Brake and roll out." This admission, found in later OKL archives, marked a turning point not only in tactics, but in morale. The Bf-109, once feared for its vertical superiority, had forfeited the climb. And with that forfeiture came a shifting of psychological dominance in the air war. RAF pilots, even rookies, began to sense this. No longer bound to defensive turning fights, they now lured German fighters upward, exploiting any lapse in discipline. Those who had once fled downward now rose like baited hooks. The maneuver's true legacy, however, reached beyond the dogfights of the 1940s. It redefined the very idea of what an aircraft could do. It proved that victory in the air did not belong solely to speed, armor, or horsepower, but to those who could manipulate the unseen thresholds, lift, drag, gravity, inertia, and make them lethal. It was the birth of a combat truth that would echo into jet warfare. Control the vertical, and you control the fight. Even after the war, veteran Spitfire pilots refused to romanticize it. They spoke not of glory, but of the moment between flight and fall, a razor interval where instinct and engineering became indistinguishable. In reunions years later, they described their greatest kills not as triumphs, but as escapes, times where their aircraft seemed not to follow orders, but to understand them. Aviation historians, poring over combat reports decades later, would find no official record of the elevator trick by name. Yet its fingerprints lay everywhere, in victory tallies, in lost Messerschmitts, in the altered tone of enemy debriefs. It had infiltrated war not as a tactic, but as a philosophy, that to win the sky, one must learn to stand on the very edge of stall without fear. And so, long after the Spitfires and Messerschmitts were grounded and their pilots aged into silence, the maneuver endured, unwritten, unnamed, but remembered in the bones of any flyer who ever dared to climb beyond reason, trusting their machine to carry them through the fall. Today, the Spitfire's wings rest silent, gleaming on airfields and in museums, their riveted skins burnished by time rather than combat, yet within their curves lies the memory of pilots who once rode them to the brink of oblivion. There are no monuments to the elevator trick, no diagrams etched in manuals, no formal doctrine to credit its creation. It belonged to no squadron, bore no signature, and was never spoken in the language of orders. It was born in the moment when fear met instinct, when a cornered pilot chose to climb rather than flee, trading certainty for possibility. Above the channel's cold expanse, where vapor trails once twisted like dueling blades, the maneuver rewrote the logic of pursuit, not through force, but through understanding. It proved that the sky could not be conquered by horsepower alone, nor by the fastest dive or the steadiest aim, but by those who dared to master the invisible threshold between flight and fall. The Messerschmitts that chased upward never found their prey. They followed only a ghost, a vanishing silhouette, before flames swallowed certainty. In the end, the elevator trick was neither trick nor illusion, but a revelation that every machine has a hidden law, every wing a final secret, discoverable only by those who ride its limits without surrender. No anthem marked its triumph. No historian crowned its inventor. It passed from war into silence, carried only in the memories of men who once felt the world go weightless beneath them. And so, when the final Spitfire lifts into a pale morning sky, banking gently over the fields where its kind once bled, it carries not triumph, but testimony. The Battle of Britain was not won by strength, nor by numbers, nor even by courage alone. It was won by those who learned, in the briefest instant before the fall, how to turn gravity itself into a weapon.